Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked to give a modern interpretation of the Bill of Rights. So, a little background here. So, the American Constitution is basically it's a contract. It outlines the duties and responsibilities of our elected officials, rights and privileges as citizens. Now, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, or the first 10 changes. So let's stop right there. Anybody that says we can't change the Constitution, actually, we can. It's called an amendment. So skipping ahead, 18th Amendment said you couldn't drink alcohol. That was a big disaster. So then they added the 21st Amendment, which basically says don't pay attention to that amendment, right? So that's how it works out. So the first 10, we know, we all go over them in school. It's called the Bill of Rights. Chavo's just photobombing the hell out of this right now. So let me just consult my little cheat sheet here. So the first 10 amendments, right? So we call them the Bill of Rights. The first one, this one has a couple parts to it. So grants freedom of worship, speech, and press, the right to petition the government and assemble peacefully. So now what you have to realize is the first 10 changes were basically, the first 10 amendments were basically reactionary to what the British had done, things that the we'll call them the founding fathers didn't like. You know, when we talk about the First Amendment, now let's go out of order here because it's a little less dense the further we get into it. So first off, petitioning your government, the idea that you could address the government, right? So really, the whole the put religion off to the side. All these things here are basically you being able to approach your government over an issue so you can peacefully assemble. Now, we've seen time and time again, sometimes peaceful assemblies may get a little chaotic. It all depends on how the people who are assembled interact with law enforcement or vice versa. I'm going to be very neutral here. I'm not going to assign any blame, but we have seen them get rather aggressive. If you think back to that photo op that Trump took at the church, there was a Black Lives Matter assembly. Police rolled in there, rubber bullets and tear gas and all that other stuff. So you have the right to assemble. You have the right to petition your government. You could write a basically a letter with enough signatures on it that may cause the government to change a particular law or address a particular grievance. All right, so freedom of press. This one's really interesting because there have been a lot of issues with the press in the past 20 years. There was a law in the books that basically said that the news had to be fair and balanced, basically. As a matter of fact, Jesse Ventura has often called the press your unofficial fourth branch of government. So you have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But the press is supposed to keep you informed as to not only what's going on locally, but what your government's doing on your behalf. Over the years, long story short, all the media has been gobbled up by about 6 or 7 companies. And so if you go on CNN, it's very pro Democrat. Usually, you go on Fox, very pro Republican, and they all have their biases. But the issue with the press as of late is should they have to give up their resources? Should they give up their source on a story? Can you monitor? You know, if I were to start a media group or start an online thing different than this, like I do, like if somebody would do like a secular talk or even like Ben Shapiro's show, Alex Jones, could the government come in and shut that down? Does it count as being deplatforming somebody? But the press is there to let you know or should know what your government's doing. Now, religion. What's really interesting about how our country approaches religion is officially we have no official religion. The taxation laws on not just churches. I'm going to use the word church. That's going to be all encompassed for all religions. The tax laws on churches are so vague that the IRS doesn't want to mess with them. John Oliver did a really good thing on mega churches and how somebody like me, I could start my own church, have people send me money, and it's tax free. And that in itself is another issue because churches, whether they, regardless of the denomination, if you add them all in, right? So all religious faiths, if you take a look at how much money they bring in, especially those mega church TV, I'ma lay the hands on you and heal you. Those jabronis bring in hundreds of millions of dollars a year that's not touched. And there's some moral, ethical questions about that, but legally, you never want to find yourself in a lawsuit that involves religious discrimination. Take, for example, Scientology. If you haven't seen the documentary Going Clear, give it a watch. It's amazing. I was speechless for over an hour. I just was, because and if any Scientologists are watching this, I apologize, but go watch that documentary. Religion in itself is some goofy shit, but then when you factor in religion plus aliens, we we hit the fence and kept running. How they got their tax exempt status was the dirty secret was they filed not only lawsuits against the IRS but individual IRS agents, and they had put so much pressure on the IRS. Not that I'm boohooing the IRS, but they put so much pressure on the IRS that they made a deal. They're like, look, how do we make this stuff go away? So they got their tax exemption. All the lawsuits went away. That was late 90s, 90-ish, I believe. I just remember being on the news. There were all these stories about how the IRS were not necessarily misappropriating funds, but were spending taxpayer dollars on certain things. And the minute that whole sociology Scientology thing worked out, those lawsuits went away. Now, freedom of speech. You're going to hear a lot about freedom of speech in the coming weeks because Donald Trump has the impeachment trial to contend with. Now, I'll do a separate, if you guys want, let me know. I'll do a separate video on what impeachment is and the history of them here in this country. But you're going to hear freedom of speech. Now, really, freedom of speech is going to be used as one of his defenses in his impeachment trial. So what his lawyers are going to argue is, one, is it constitutional to impeach a president after his term's already over? The other is going to be the things that he said at his rally before what happened at the Capitol building is going to fall under free speech. Those are going to be the arguments. We could talk about it later. When we talk about the issue of free speech in itself, in the origins of where it came from, was literally being able to question your government publicly. You got to remember, there's all these amendments are reactionary from the Revolutionary War. What were the major grievances from when we were under the thumb of England? What were the things that kind of pissed us off the most? So being able to question, being able to say, hey, I think that's wrong. No, over here, I want to do this. We want to do this. Being able to question your government. Over the years, it's come to factor in a lot of different types of speech. So burning the American flag, for example, while many people will consider it distasteful, constitutionally protected. Wearing a particular article of clothing with a slogan on it, the rule of thumb is your rights end when it impedes on somebody else's rights, but you do not have the right to not be offended. So when we talk about speech, George Carlin, was it the 7 words you can't say on television? Swearing at the police, it might be distasteful, but it's constitutionally protected language. Where the lines in the sand get drawn with free speech is obviously you can't slander people, you can't defame people, you can't do anything that may be considered liable in the court of law. You certainly cannot make direct threats against people. So if I say I'm going to kick so-and-so's ass or I'm going to murder so-and-so, that's not protected speech. Now, as a school teacher, it always takes on an interesting kind of role within schools because schools, we have codes of conduct, right? So there's certain things that you can and can't do. You do surrender your right when you walk into a school to a certain degree. You do surrender your rights to a certain degree when you go to work. If your boss says, hey, Paul, I don't know who Paul is, but Paul that reports late, what's going on, and Paul turns around and says, "Fuck you, kiss my ass." That's not protected by the First Amendment because there are certain codes of conduct. A really, really good documentary that you could watch if you that specifically deals with First Amendment issues is a book called "Shouting Fire" from the edges of the first the from the edge of the First Amendment, and it goes through some of the things. If you work for a company, can you be silenced? Do you surrender? When do you surrender some of those rights? Same thing in a courtroom. There's procedure that you have to go through. Freedom of speech also, we also extend it to books. Books have always been a fascinating thing to me because I do understand some of the words that are in there. But the laws about that, when Harry Potter first came out, there was a Christian group that wanted Harry Potter to be banned because it was teaching witchcraft. Fact of the matter is, if you don't want to read the book, same thing with music, right? So if you remember, I remember back in the day they were going to outlaw rap, and Dee Snider from Twisted Sister and John fucking Denver, the most vanilla human being on the planet, they get before a congressional hearing and they say, look, music is expression. When we talk about limiting free speech, it's a very slippery slope. Voltaire is often credited with saying this, but I think it was somebody else. While I may not agree with what you say, I will defend your right to say it. Because the philosophical question is who gets to draw the lines in the sand, that this is okay, that's not okay. And when it comes to political speech, dude, the KKK's had more lawsuits involving free speech than any other organization. And they've always come out, pretty much 90% of the time, they've come out on the side of, okay, they're assholes, but there's no law against being an asshole. So speech, music, books. There were certain books like The Grapes of Wrath at one point wasn't in circulation. Robin Hood, not the app, the book, the story, at one point in the 30s out of fear of communism. No, we're not going to include that. But the only book, and I got called out for this by one of my students, I have to double check this. The only book that I could think of that you can't find in Barnes and Noble. You might be able to find it online. You might find it in like a little bookstore somewhere. But the only book that comes to mind that you can't find is something called the Anarchist Cookbook, because that like taught you how to make like homemade bombs and stuff. The only book, so that's the only book I could think of that you may not be able to find. But even when we're doing movies, when we're doing books, there was a lawsuit involving, started off as a murder case where this father of the year, had his child murdered in order to get, or there was an attempted murder of the kid to get a insurance settlement. Fortunately, the kid didn't pass away. The backstory behind it was the hospital messed up when the kid was born, and there was a huge multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and all that money was supposed to go to the kid's bills, and he was hooked up to a different monitors. So when this hitman walked into this house and tried to murder the kid, the O2 sensor went off, and he ran away. From that case, there was another case in which the top First Amendment lawyer was asked to be part of the prosecution because the hitman in the murder case had a book entitled, very cleverly, Hitman. And it told you in specifics what type of gun you could buy, where you can buy it, where the serial numbers were, how to get rid of the serial numbers, how to wear like different size shoes to throw off your footprints when walking in mud. It was way too detailed, and the publishing company got in trouble for that because there are certain things that, yes, we can't communicate through movies, through books, but there are limits, if you will, to the limits. First speech is one of the more hotly debated, especially in the past couple of weeks, especially for the past couple of years. who gets to say what you can and can't say, and that's a conversation that will go on for many years, because there are going to be people, depending on the situation, they might have a certain feeling. Can you make fun of churches? Can you make fun of politicians? A really good lawsuit that occurred of that was the dude who published Hustler, Harry Flynn. He made fun of a um, a TV preacher. They did a cartoon. Basically, he lost his virginity to his mom in an outhouse, and they went to sue him. They went to sue Hustler and Harry Flynn, and Harry Flynn came out on the right side of that. If just because you don't like it, just because you don't like to hear it, uh, it's neither here nor there. It has to fall in with very specific guidelines. Now, there is a podcast and a YouTube channel called Legal Eagle. Give a shout out to them. He goes much more in depth on the different lawsuits involved in the First Amendment. But that's going to be it for tonight. Tune in tomorrow, because we're going to talk about the Second Amendment, which has to do with firearms. And that's my shout out to Cactus Jack. Have a good night.